So just sort of having a bird's eye view of sort of philosophical traditions.
Yeah.
In the West, I think there's a Cambridge philosopher, Whitehead, who said that the history of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And there's a kind of core story or idea in the philosophy of Plato, which is quite a powerful archetype. And it's very well known, the analogy of the cave, and that our predicament is that we're all unknowingly prisoners of this cave, and the metaphor is that we're all chained up at the back of a cave, facing the wall of the cave,
right?
And there's a fire behind us that we can't see, and between the fire and us there are various objects paraded, and all we see is the shadow of those on the wall.
This is Plato's
analogy.
Where did he write about this then?
In the Republic.
Oh, in the Republic. Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't read that. And then he's talking about that in terms of illusion, is he?
Yes. That what we take to be real is in point of fact just a play of shadows.
Yeah. So we're looking towards the back.
We're looking towards the back of a cave, seeing all these shadows played out on the wall.
Yeah.
And we think that's reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the task of the philosopher or the seeker after truth or whatever is to somehow break out of the cave.
Yeah.
And head back up to the, daylight.
Right.
And the outside world and, reality.
Right. And what does he talk about? What the nature of that reality is then? What is outside the cave? What is there?
Well, I mean, for him it was typically he would call it the world of forms, which we think of as sort of abstract ideas, if you like.
Yeah.
But they're more than just ideas in the mental sense.
Yeah.
They're actually sort of profound archetypes within a more universal consciousness, if you like.
Yeah.
Although he wouldn't use those terms exactly.
Yeah.
But so the central idea is that we've got to somehow overcome illusion.
Yeah.
And the other classical injunction that goes along with this is know thyself.
Yeah.
That's a sort of ancient maxim from
you see that in every religion,
everywhere.
Yeah.
So the idea is that it's not just that we're under an illusion about the nature of the world around us.
Yeah.
But that we are under some fairly profound illusion about what we are.
Yeah.
So that sort of goes hand in hand with it. And there's some interest. When he describes this metaphor, he sort of describes the plight of the philosopher who manages to break out, and takes him a while to adjust to the bright light of the real world, and then of course he feels duty bound to go back in and help his former fellow prisoners to escape. And he also suggests that might not be so easy, and that he might actually even be met with a hostile reception.
Didn't that end up so well for Socrates, did it? Really?
Well, exactly. And it's a very powerful idea. In fact, the modern retelling of it is, of course, the movie The Matrix.
Okay.
And I think that's why it was so popular.
Okay.
Because there's our hero Neo, who's actually imprisoned in a pod, and has been there all his life, wired up in a dream world, computer-generated dream world, and he doesn't realise, and so they come and rescue him.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very powerful idea, and I think that's probably why that movie was so popular.
Yes. There was also that film with Jim Carrey, wasn't there, where he basically is in a film set all his life.
Yes.
And then he breaks out.
I
like that film.
Yeah, that's exactly. So it's a very powerful idea.
Yeah.
Now, on the thing about the self, I think that Eastern religions are more focused on the illusion of the involved in know thyself.
Yeah.
Because I think that's actually what it hinges on.
Right.
That your false idea about what the world is actually anchored in a false idea about what you are.
But didn't Plato also talk about? I mean, wasn't his main thing self-inquiry, or was that more Socrates? Was it?
No, not really. See, in the West, it was more about getting to know the truth. Socrates was always questioning people about what they thought was going on.
Yes.
what is virtue, what is courage, what is the right way to live.
Yeah.
And he was basically a pain in the neck, actually, because he questioned all of these people, and by probing them and exposing their arguments, he was sort of basically showing that people really didn't know, actually. So that's why they did away with him in the end, probably because he upset too many people. But in the East, it was much more based on this idea of know thyself. And so in the East, you get this idea that the sense of self that you have when you're a prisoner is what they call the ego, or ahamkara is the term they have for it. And that's not your real self. That's actually a kind of an illusion.
Right. But it's the thing we identify with.
But it's the thing we habitually identify with. And by breaking free of this illusion, getting out of the cave of illusion, we can then come to know ourselves as we truly are. So then you get the idea that there are kind of two selves. There's your ego self, and then there's your higher self. And that's a very powerful idea that's found in even parallels in religion. I mean, for example, in Christianity, you get the idea of the fallen self. You know, and then there's the whole journey to redemption. You know, so there's this quite profound duality with this sort of sense of, you know, two selves. And I've got here a quote from an Eastern scripture, the Upanishads, which sums it up very nicely. So I thought I'd just read that out. It's talking, their remedy is to basically come to a kind of meditative stillness. Because the illusions of the ego are exacerbated by the suffering and the mental turmoil that goes along with that. And so they sort of first address that. You know, to become still and allow the mind that is generating all of these illusions to be quiet. To give the sort of some hope that the light might shine through.
So that's like in yoga with Patanjali, when he talks about, I can't remember the exact quote, like saying the purpose of yoga is to still the riches of the mind.
To still the mind.
That's the first goal of yoga.
That's the first, and you know, in some ways even the ultimate goal, because if you can do that, then the illusion will fall away. So it says here, when the five senses are stilled, when the mind is stilled, when the intellect is stilled, that is called the highest state by the wise. They say yoga is this complete stillness in which one enters the state of unity, never to become separate again. There are two selves, the separate ego and the indivisible Atman, and that's the term for the higher self, the Atman. When one rises above I and me and mine, the Atman is revealed as one's true self, one's real self. When all the desires that surge in the heart are renounced, the mortal becomes immortal. When all the knots that strangle the heart are loosened, the mortal becomes immortal. This sums up the teaching of the scriptures.
That's from the Upanishads.
That's from the Upanishads, the Katha Upanishad. So that's kind of.
So if you take Atman, the notion of that, how does God, Shiva, the creator,
fit in with that?
Yes, with Atman. Is Atman...
Ultimately, they are one. Atman is Brahman. Brahman is the term for ultimate reality. And that's the sort of good news, really, if you like. So in
other words, it's shedding your perception of yourself as
shedding
limited,
yourself as a limited,
and
separate
realizing
individual,
that you're God.
And realizing ultimately.
Sounds good.
It does sound good, doesn't it? It sounds wonderful. However, there is a sneaky little catch to this story.
Of course.
And that is, who is it exactly that makes the journey from identification with the ego to identification as Atman? So you get this idea that, well, here I am, I'm thinking I'm this little ego, but then I can shift my identification to this much broader, universal consciousness. But who is it that's identifying there, and then who's made the journey? Because that seems to imply there are now three of us. That's a little bit weird. And so there's another more.
So you mean like there's an I that identifies with the ego
Yeah,
as a separate thing?
as a separate thing.
Okay, yes, I see. What
You see, it sees itself as an object in
Yes.
a way.
but we
then
do
there's
that though, don't we?
We do that, yeah. It's almost like a reflex.
Yeah,
I mean, Patanjali calls it asmita, false identification.
yeah,
It's like a reflex to identify.
yeah.
But the question is, who's doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And it gets a little paradoxical,
Mhm.
you know, because as I said, you get this idea that, well, you can identify there, or you can identify with this much more expanded.
Yes,
So
but there's still a thing that's
there's
identifying with
still
one
a
or
thing.
the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So who's that? Because isn't that who you really are? So there's some kind of tricky thing going on
Yes.
there.
Yes.
So
What do you mean? What do you mean tricky in terms of trying to explain it, or tricky in terms of?
trying to conceptualize it, I
Yeah,
suppose.
okay.
Tricky in terms of trying to understand it
Yeah.
with them. I mean, you know, tricky in terms of trying to understand it with the mind, I suppose.
Yeah.
And in point of fact, in Western philosophy, the investigation into this goes quite deep. I mean, there was a philosopher, Kant, who talked about, it's a rather grand phrase, but he talked about the synthetic unity of apperception. And that sounds rather kind of challenging, but all it really means is that if there's a series of experiences, in order for them to be intelligible, they have to refer to the one subject
Yes, no,
who's
completely
experiencing them all.
makes complete sense. I mean, I'm sure that's why the so-called ego. I don't really like the term ego because it tends to be associated with sort of egocentric behaviour rather than ego, which is just a perception of you as a separate individual. And
Yes, we're not talking
about.
about the sort of social sense of being an egomaniac or being a... No, we're talking about something more fundamental than
This
that.
identification with this individual
Yes,
person with a history.
with a history, a
Yes.
past and a future.
Well, I'm sure that's why, but I think that's a construct of our nervous system, in a way that part of our mind, our brain, has to maintain some illusion of continuity.
Yes.
That there is of continuity of experience, that there is and some reference point for this sensory information that's coming into us.
Right.
I mean, it's obvious that our mind does that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like we, even with our eyes, you know, the left and the right are confused, and all the stimuli change over in your
Yes.
pons here. You know what I mean? So it's like the reality is we're just filtering all this,
Yes.
and we're creating something out of it
Yes.
that appears to have some continuity.
Yes.
Because otherwise maybe it would be too much, or I don't know.
Yes.
Or we wouldn't be able to function. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's
I don't know.
a necessary part of development in order to function as an individual, a biological
But on the other
individual.
hand, some people get beyond that and they can still function, can't they? So
And also you look at sort of the animal kingdom, and they seem to be
Yeah.
able to function very well, but you wonder, do they have a developed sense of self? Do they
Yeah.
have any awareness of that really?
sure.
And yet they function fine. So
Like an
where-
ant, would it consider itself to be,
Yeah, anything
An
at all.
ant. or
It's just being an ant.
well, maybe it does. We don't know, do we?
Well,
I mean,
we don't know.
how can we tell? Or a rock.
Yeah.
Does a rock know it's a rock?
I mean, there are interesting experiments they've done with sort of chimpanzees and things about whether they have a sense of self really.
Yeah.
There's a really good fun one where they have a couple of chimps and they're given a task and they're
Yeah.
rewarded with food.
Yeah.
And one chimp is fed bits of cucumber, and he's perfectly happy with that,
Yeah.
until he suddenly realises that the other chimp is being rewarded with grapes,
Right.
and he goes absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
You know, because he's being hard done by.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you think, well, that's quite an evolved sense of self, isn't it? You know,
Mhm.
I'm being hard done by. This
Mhm.
isn't fair. It's not just a
No.
mechanical. He was quite happy
But-
with it before. You know.
It could be part of the whole. I mean, you know, we were talking last night about the tree. You know, that tree up there, which
Yes.
is two trees which created this single shape.
Yes.
And there was this book. I can't remember what it's called. Is it The Secret Life of Trees? Have you read that
Right.
one?
Right.
Where it appears that trees have some degree of consciousness.
Right.
That they know where they are in relationship to I mean, this is maybe fanciful, but you know, there is some.
Right.
Perhaps even self-awareness. I don't know. Would you
Well,
say a
that's
tree
the thing is, there can be consciousness in some sense, but does that entail a sense of self?
I don't know.
It's the sense of self that seems to be the mysterious add-on.
Yeah,
and then lots.
But I've often thought that sense of self is incredibly well. Obviously, it's illusionary, but I often feel that it's there's a desperate attempt that we spend so much of our energy trying to create and maintain this sense of self,
Yeah.
and identity, because I get the feeling because it's so fragile. Really, we know it's not real, so we
have to bolster it all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so fragile.
Right.
That we have to spend a lot of energy, like we all do that, don't we? So I don't know. I don't know if a tree has a sense of self as a separate, as an individual tree, or an ant does.
I somehow doubt it, but but the point about the philosophical traditions that that I've been looking at, and you have as well for many years, is that false self we're talking about in some traditions is regarded as the ego.
Yeah.
So the idea is that if that ego, that false self, could somehow fall away or dissolve or whatever, then there'd be this great big true self, this Atman, that would be revealed.
Yeah.
And there's a slightly tricky thing about the philosophy at that point, because then you say to yourself, well, if the ego is an illusion, always has, so whose illusion is it?
Mm-hmm.
Who or what is entertaining the illusion?
Mm-hmm.
And the old analogy that they use in the Eastern Vedantic scriptures is of the snake and the rope, which again is very well known, but the idea is that there's a coil of rope on the floor, and because it's dim lighting or whatever, it's mistaken for a snake.
Yeah.
And of course that induces panic and fear, and oh my God, there's this terrible snake. And the responses to that are, well, we have to battle the snake, we have to call the zoo, get the snake expert out to come and deal with it, and all the rest of it. But upon investigation, we have a good laugh because it's discovered that actually there never was a snake.
Yeah, never was.
There never was. It's not just that somehow the snake became the rope again, or that the rope became a snake and now has gone back to being a rope.
Yeah.
None of that happened.
Yeah.
There was only ever the rope.
Yeah.
So you can call up the zoo and tell the guy not to come.
Yeah.
But again, you see, there's the same paradoxical situation that, well, who is it or what is it that entertained the idea that it was a snake and not? If the analogy is that the snake is the ego and that the rope is the true self, then who is it that entertains the illusion that it's being a snake? And there's a contradiction, a flat out logical contradiction in some of the Eastern scriptures about that. And I made a reference to that. There was a very great philosopher, Shankara, who wrote a book, Atmabodha, Self-Knowledge. And in one sutra he says that the true self is changeless. And
so he's talking about the Atman.
He's talking about the Atman.
Yeah.
Absolutely changeless, serene,
Yeah.
Beyond the vicissitudes of the mind and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But then he says that the self regards itself as a separate ego and then falls prey to fear. And then regains its natural fearlessness when the illusion is seen through. But that's not changeless then. That Atman is actually getting deluded.
Yes. But in some philosophies they would say that there is an appearance of that rather than it actually happening.
Right.
It appears to happen.
It appears to happen.
Yes.
To who?
Well, to the Atman, isn't it? That's the thing. That's to.
But then does the Atman become thereby deluded? Because there's suffering involved. You see, this is the point, and the point of all this in the end is to somehow either come to terms with or transcend the suffering.
Yeah.
So it's a knotty problem. I mean, philosophically.
But the suffering is only from the individual's point of view, isn't it? From I mean, I suppose it might sound harsh, but there is like an appearance of suffering.
Yes.
And suffering is always relational, isn't it? In terms of like, well, one person in one situation will suffer, another person won't, or so it's entirely dependent on a sense of an individual who is experiencing something which is painful, right? Isn't it?
I think what you're suggesting there, that maybe it isn't the pain itself that's the problem, but the identification with it, or the...
Well, possibly. I mean, I know people who, people who can go to the dentist. There was this guy, I think it was Governor Mutter, was talking about it recently at a conference. He's saying, well, he can go to the dentist. He'd rather not have any injection in his mouth because he doesn't like the effect.
Right.
So he'll just get the dentist to drill away, and he can detach from it.
Right.
Well, I couldn't do that.
That's a useful trick.
I couldn't do that.
God.
But I mean, some people can. And I know, we were talking about this this woman in the concentration camp last night.
Right.
What's her name? I can't remember.
I don't know her surname. Edith somebody.
Yeah. Who was writing about her experience, in the midst of extreme suffering, and actually experiencing that as blissful.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to, obviously suffering is serious for people, but I guess it is dependent on there being an individual. I suppose then the bigger question could be, does God or the Atman, is he or her or it capable of suffering?
Right.
I don't know.
Well, that's the paradoxical question, because
Right.
neither answer works. If you say, well, it is capable of suffering,
Mm-hmm.
then that's not the Atman that we're after.
Right.
That doesn't seem to be the goal.
Because there's certainly in Christianity, there's the whole idea about Christ suffering for us, all that sort
Yes.
of thing, and then there is also the notion of God sending His Son and the suffering involved in giving up His Son, and you know what I mean. So there is
Absolutely.
there
But
is
if you,
all that in tradition.
But if you look at the history of all of that, the philosophical history of all of that, it's absolute can of worms.
Yeah.
Because they could never they could never work out how Christ could be both a man
Yeah.
and God,
Yeah.
and how he could both be a suffering individual on the cross and
Yeah.
suffering doubts in the Garden of Gethsemane, and at the same time be one person of the Trinity.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a sort of...
But that doesn't apply to us. So how can we be these individuals
yes,
here
exactly.
in this apparent? Well, we're sitting in a garden and with senses and an apparent sense of individuality, but the reality is we're not that, and we are a reflection, or not even a reflection, just God.
Yes.
That's all there is.
That's
right?
all there is. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
So that's all there is.
That's the sort of traditional, Advaita point of view. But it doesn't. As I said, there's a logical paradox and a difficulty involved with that, because
Mhm.
there's still the question of, well, who is suffering? Who does the suffering appear? If it's all just appearance,
Mhm.
who does it, or who or what does it appear to?
Mhm.
Now, there is another strand
Mm.
in Eastern philosophy which addresses itself to that, and
Mhm.
in some ways it's the most radical,
Mhm.
most intriguing,
Mhm.
and I suppose most difficult in a way. What it says is that the appearance of the snake.
What tradition are you talking about?
Well, it's actually originally Buddhism.
Okay.
We can go on to talk about it. There are references to it also in Advaita Vedanta.
Okay.
But there are different strands to it. It's
Yeah.
not as simple as that when you actually analyse the texts.
Yeah.
But the suggestion is that the illusion of the snake appears to the snake.
Say again.
The illusion of there being a snake
Right.
appears to the snake.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Where does the rope fit in?
The rope is what's there when that illusion dissolves.
Okay.
Okay, so the rope then, in that analogy, is reality.
Uh-huh.
So, but this is an impossible and ridiculous idea, that the illusion is appearing to the one
Uh-huh.
who is the illusion.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So we have to then ask yourself, well, in that case, because the snake is an illusion, it's not even a real illusion, it's an illusory illusion.
Mhm.
So in a certain sense, all you can say, because the snake isn't real, so how can the illusion appear to the snake, is that the illusion appears to no one.
That makes more sense.
There is no one. And from no one, arising from no one, there arises an illusion of being,
Right.
a self.
Yeah.
And that illusion appears to no one, and will be seen through, if it is seen through, by no one.
Yeah.
Now that is a very challenging idea, because then the whole picture, sort of quasi-religious picture of redemption, of going from the fallen self, the ego, to the true self, knowing God, or from the ego to the Atman, the journey from one to the other, is undermined, completely undermined. And you actually get then, and I've got another quote here, also from the Vedantic tradition, but very, very different to what we quoted before in the Upanishads. The scriptures proclaim aloud, there is no truth in creation and no destruction. No one is bound and no one is seeking liberation. No one is on the way to deliverance. There are none who are liberated. This is the absolute truth, my dear disciple. This is the sum and substance of all the Upanishads.
What's that from?
That actually is Shankara.
Oh, really?
From the question of discrimination. That's a very different picture.
Yeah.
From the picture that I read out before.
Yeah.
Quite radically different.
Yeah.
Now that approach, he's actually quoting from another sage in that tradition, a chap called Gaudapada, who was regarded as being heavily influenced by Buddhism. Now in Buddhism you have this very powerful doctrine, anatman, that there is no self. It's not just that the ego is an illusion, but because both traditions maintain that.
Yeah.
But that once the ego is dissolved, the sort of Atman, the true self that is then supposed to be revealed, that too is an illusion. It's just actually the same illusion, really, on the bigger scale, if you like.
Yeah.
And so, in Buddhism, and here's a quote from the Diamond Sutra in Buddhism, all living beings will eventually be led by me to the final nirvana, the final ending of the cycle of birth and death. And when this unfathomable infinite number of living beings have all been liberated, in truth not even a single being has actually been liberated. Why? Because if a disciple still clings to the arbitrary illusions of form or phenomena such as ego, a personality, a self, a separate person, or a universal self existing eternally, then that person is not a true disciple.
Wow. Where was that from?
That's from the Diamond
Sutra.
The Diamond Sutra.
You don't tend to hear that very much.
No. And this.
Why not?
This strand of Buddhism, if you really take it on board, the realization of no self, is actually very radical and very undermining of a lot of the sort of sentiments that quite often align themselves to those other traditions. The idea that there's an ego that can be transcended, and then you'll be free and you'll realize your true self. Even in Buddhism's attention, because there are other strands of Buddhism where they talk about one's original Buddha nature, or one's essential nature, and that you'll somehow sort of return to that somehow.
Sure.
But this particular strand, which sometimes just goes under the term non-duality, is saying that there is not and never has been any self of any kind, and that the illusion arises and is the appearance appears to no one, and the seeing through of it is seen by no one.
Yeah, and that completely contradicts people's experience there, doesn't it? Their everyday experience. It's very difficult to grasp because it's completely contradictory.
It's very challenging.
What we feel.
Yeah.
As an individual.
It's very challenging. At the same time, though, the reality out of which, so to speak, arises the sense of self, and which eventually is seen through, is itself full, simultaneously full and empty.
Mm-hmm.
So what the individual me is actually seeking for
Mm-hmm.
is that.
Mm-hmm.
So in a certain sense, when you get the sort of paradigm that we are an ego but we're seeking to find our true self, that's a misconception,
Mm-hmm.
because we imagine that we will still be there to enjoy
Yes.
the liberation. There'll be somebody there enjoying
Yes.
liberation, realizing liberation, or whatever. But liberation is not of the person or of the self, it's from the person or from the self. But nonetheless, it is nonetheless that which is sought for.
Yeah. Because there's no other way really that an individual can conceptualize it otherwise. There will be no benefit
Yes.
in pursuing any kind of spiritual
Yes.
pursuit
Yes.
if there wasn't an end goal
Exactly. Exactly.
of a better life. Or
Yes. Exactly. Something in it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You see,
I mean, I'm wondering
what that whole scenario then is actually then seen as is a way of denying that this is it,
Mm-hmm.
as it is.
Yeah.
The immediately given
Yeah.
is it.
Yeah.
Whereas this seems like it's not enough.
Yes.
So we project that there must be some other state of consciousness, other state of being,
Yes.
other thing that can be realized that will do the trick.
So I wonder why it's perceived like that. Why is this, deep yearning for, an apparent reconnection with God, with something else that so many people feel? Where does that stem from? Because there does appear to be a sense of wanting to come back home somehow.
Yes.
Wanting to, and that is sort of all-consuming, isn't it, in some people? So this apparent illusion appears to be very powerful.
Yes, definitely. But you could say that in the absence of me, in the absence of a self, there is wholeness, fullness,
Yeah.
and emptiness. So
do they just? The Atman God is often described like that, as being empty and full at the same time,
right,
as being the source of everything and everything merging back into. Well, so like the source of everything, being full, being empty. All these things are described. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying something else?
well, that the ancient debate between the Buddhists and the Vedantas was always about whether that ground of all, the emptiness that is full,
Yeah.
is a self or not, capital S.
Right.
And and basically a Buddhist would say that to maintain that it is a self actually just betrays the fact that there are still residues of a sense of self
Mm-hmm.
that is sort of purloining that
Sure.
as
Yeah.
a quality.
Yeah. Because we tend to attribute certain qualities, don't we,
Yeah.
to it? Compassion,
Whereas
love, all those
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas from the other point of view, the Vedantas would say, well, the Buddhists talk about emptiness. That
Yeah.
there's no self. It's emptiness. All they really mean by that is the stillness of the self.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It's the self in a period of inactivity.
Right.
So they think, well, it's not real emptiness. It's the stillness of the self.
Okay.
So that's the
Interesting.
the point about it being, from the point of view of the seeing that there's no one, is that as long as as long as it's conceived as being the sort of properties of a self,
Yeah.
then there's the idea that the little me, can somehow become the big me.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whereas the situation from the point of view of the seeing of the no self is that's never going to happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the snake was never the snake, really.
No. It only appeared to. It only appeared to be, and appeared to no one.
Mm.
So we go from sort of two selves, the ego and the self, to the ego's an illusion, so there's just the big self.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
But then maybe that too is just the same illusion, really.
Uh-huh.
But that last step is, if it is a last step, is so radical as to be actually very undermining. And in fact, we talked a bit about it in terms of the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, which is another very powerful Eastern philosophy. And they talk about the different means or the different methods.
Yeah. The upayas.
The upayas. And the idea is that you sort of graduate from one to the other, but there are lots of scriptures and talks about methods of meditation and different practices that you might do. But the sort of ultimate upaya is called anupaya, which means no method.
Yeah.
And not no method because you've tried all the other methods and they're finally culminating in this one. There's no method because there's nothing that can be done. I mean, there's Abhinavagupta, who's one of the sages of that tradition, actually says in the Tantraloka, there's nothing at all that the apparent individual self can do to liberate itself. Because the very basis on which it's operating is an illusion.
Yeah.
So that's challenging.
Yeah.
And very interesting.
Yes.
So leaves not a lot to be said.
I'm just wondering what else. I'll just go for a walk.
Well,
have lunch.
but what do you feel about that? I mean, do you
What
think?
do I feel
Yeah, I
about
mean, do you think?
Is it important? What I feel about it ultimately probably is of no significance at all. What I feel about it. Well, I suppose from my own personal sort of contemplation on all this, and it is ultimately a sense of nothingness, really, or dissolving into nothingness, dissolving into something which is impossible to describe. But I'm coming back to it's like I am that thing from Plato about the cave, and we're looking, at the back of the cave.
Right.
Okay, and then there's light coming in, isn't there, to create shadows, you could say. And we're just looking the wrong way, but we're also, it's like you could say we are kind of that light creating the shadows. So it's impossible for us to perceive that as a separate thing, because that's what we are. And so in that sense there is nowhere to go.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing to do, for sure. There's nowhere to go. And so yeah, I mean, when we're just sitting here now, I can there's a sense of things arising from nothing.
Yeah.
Appearing to rise from nothing.
Yes.
But it's not in a negative or nihilistic sense. That's just how it is.
Yeah. I mean, far from it's awesome. It's awesome to see.
Yeah.
Everything
and
arise.
Because we were talking like, well, what is in this for an individual? Well, obviously there isn't anything in it for an individual. But on the other hand, coming from that place, it is a place of extreme stillness, you could say. I mean, it's beyond stillness in a way, but it takes the freneticism of having to, I don't know, justify your existence or achieve something or change something. You know what I mean? So that in that sense, that drops away. So that's from this body-mind mechanism, as Ramesh would call it, perspective, that is a relief.
Yes.
So there is, I mean, you know, there are some benefits. At least
you could say. I think the way to say it is that emptiness and that fullness, from which the sense of me, albeit an illusion, arises, and from which everything arises, is what is sought for.
Yes.
So yes, of course.
Yes.
It's just that when you say, you know, well, there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go and there's no journey to make, it's not quite that. It's that there's no one to make it.
No.
And that's quite.
No, that's true.
That's a different emphasis.
Yeah.
Because it seems to imply. I mean, you sometimes hear people who respond to this by saying, "Well, I'm not going to get out of bed in the morning, and I'm not going to go to do my job, and I'm not going to, you know, this is nothing to be done, and there's nowhere to go."
Like it sounds negative, but it's obviously not.
Right.
Is it?
So it's not like that, because it's not that there's nowhere to go and nothing to do, and all this. It's just that there's no one to do it. So all of that, going to work and living a life, happens anyway. But it's going to happen anyway. You can't.
Like I'm going to breathe.
Yeah.
I'm going to have lunch.
Yeah.
Sure.
But it is when it's put like that, it definitely is more challenging, and if there is an investment in a process, and an investment in being on a journey, and an investment in getting a result,
yes,
then it very radically undermines that.
Yes. And I'm quite intrigued by this whole notion that I think is not particularly helpful, but that there appears to be a point at which one realizes that. There appears to be a point where that becomes very obvious.
Yes.
And that certain things drop away. But I suppose the realization is that it's always been like that.
Yes, I think that
it was never any different.
Yes.
That was always like that. And it could not be anything different.
Right. But that's what I find so intriguing about illusion. It's not like I was chatting to someone else, emailing someone else about this the other day. We were talking about, well, being subjected to a virus, you know, a disease.
This is Richard, you
yes, a mind virus.
Right.
You know, that you're completely bewitched by this illusion.
Yeah.
And the analogy was that it's like a virus that you might hopefully throw off.
Right.
But he actually suggested that hypnosis is a better word.
Okay.
Because the point about illusion is not that it's something real that you're suffering from,
no,
and that then you're relieved of it.
No.
Because what's realised when the illusion dispels is that it never held.
No,
it was never the case.
No, it was never.
And that's what's. I remember as a very young boy being intrigued by this. I had a horrible nightmare of being eaten by a whale, and I woke up. It was so horrible that it woke me up. But when I woke up, I was simultaneously relieved, but also intrigued. I was so happy not to be being eaten by a whale, and this happiness lasted all day. But people at school actually said, you know, what are you grinning about? And I said, isn't it wonderful? I'm not being eaten by a whale. Sometimes it's talked about that you could almost say that probably the word purpose is not a good word, but the purpose of the arising of the illusion is for the joy and the fun when it falls away.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they talk
It's
about
like a
that
magic show.
in Shaivism as well, about the God wanting to experience itself. And,
Yes.
And
The Sufi mystics have a saying, I was a hidden treasure,
yeah,
and I longed to be known,
yeah,
so I created the world.
yeah,
So it's the similar idea.
yeah.
It's a similar idea.
And Janashva talks about it, doesn't he, as well, in a very beautiful way. God experiencing himself through apparent form, apparent separation.
Yes, like a nectar that becomes a bee.
Yes.
In order to taste itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful.
All that
it's
stuff.
poetry.
It's lovely.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful. And how is all this for you then?
I suppose it was actually Tony once said to me, there doesn't need to be an event.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And I suppose there was a part at that time, there was a part of me that was looking forward to this event when
Yes, sure.
everything wonderful was going to happen.
Yeah, I think
And it
that's
was all
very
going to fall.
unhelpful, isn't it?
It was all going to fall away.
Yeah.
And the fact is, the more you entertain, the more it's seen that this is it. Then this is it. What's immediately given.
Mm-hmm.
Then it is simply seen very clearly that all of those other things are illusory and false. So you see them all as a way of denying that this is it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like strategies for avoiding.
Yeah, for avoiding this fact.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this is more perfectly what is sought. This is more perfectly what is sought than anything that the mind could imagine or conjure up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.